Sometimes the smallest mistake can change everything. One wrong name, one innocent hand reaching for a letter, and two lives are thrown into danger neither of them saw coming. Jacob Whitmore was a mountain man who kept to himself in the Wyoming hills. He'd lived 15 quiet years there, far from trouble. Then he handed a sealed letter to the wrong woman in town. Sarah Bennett was a schoolteacher. Sarah Beaumont was the daughter of the territory's most feared cattle baron. By sunset, Jacob knew his mistake. 200 armed cowboys were riding toward his cabin, sent by a man who didn't forgive and didn't forget. The letter held a secret worth killing for. Now Jacob and Sarah must stand together and face an army in the darkness. What was in that letter? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Wyoming mountains in 1882 were unforgiving to most men, but Jacob Whitmore had made his peace with them 15 years ago. He'd built his cabin with his own hands in a high valley where the pine trees grew thick and the streams ran cold and clear even in August. It was a day's hard ride from the nearest town, and that suited him just fine. Jacob was 43 years old, though the mountain life had weathered him in ways that made exact age hard to pin down. His hands were strong and scarred from years of trapping, skinning, and working leather. His beard was full and dark, touched with grey at the edges. His eyes were the colour of storm clouds, and they held the kind of quiet that came from a man who'd seen enough of the world to know when to speak and when to stay silent. Every week, Jacob made the journey down to Prescott Valley with pelts and whatever else he'd trapped or crafted. The town sat in a broad valley where cattle ranchers had built their empires and farmers tried to carve out honest livings from stubborn soil. It wasn't much of a town, a main street with a general store, a saloon, a boarding house, a church, and a schoolhouse that doubled as a meeting hall. But it was civilization, and even a mountain man needed supplies. The general store was run by Otto Garrett, a German immigrant who'd come west with dreams of gold and settled for steadier work. Otto knew Jacob's routine as well as anyone could. Every Tuesday morning, Jacob would arrive with his pack mule loaded down, and they'd conduct their business with few words and fair prices. Otto never pried into Jacob's past, and Jacob appreciated that more than the man probably knew. The town had grown some in recent years. More families were settling in, trying to make the valley their own. A new schoolteacher had arrived last spring, brought in from back east to educate the children of ranchers and farmers alike. Her name was Sarah Bennett, and she'd caused quite a stir when she first stepped off the stage. Sarah was 28, with auburn hair she wore pinned up proper and green eyes that held both kindness and intelligence. She'd come from Pennsylvania, where she'd taught at a private school until her parents passed within months of each other. With nothing tying her to the east and a desire to start fresh somewhere new, she'd answered an advertisement for a teacher in the Wyoming territory. The town had taken to her quickly. She was patient with the children, firm when needed, and had a way of making even the roughest ranch hand tip his hat and mind his manners when she passed. She boarded at Mrs. Henderson's place, a respectable widow who ran the boarding house with strict rules and stricter curfews. Jacob had seen the new teacher a handful of times in his weekly visits. They'd exchanged polite nods, but never much conversation. He wasn't much for talking, and she seemed to understand that about the mountain folk who came to town. There was a quiet respect between them, the kind that didn't need words, but Prescott Valley lived under a shadow that no amount of respectability could quite lift. That shadow had a name, Beaumont. The Beaumont family controlled nearly every acre of grazing land for 30 miles in any direction. Old Thomas Beaumont had come to the territory 40 years ago with nothing but ambition and a ruthless streak that would make his fortune. He'd claimed land, run off settlers, and built a cattle empire through means both legal and otherwise. Now in his 70s, Thomas ruled from his ranch like a feudal lord, and the 3 territories knew better than to cross him. His children had inherited his disposition, The eldest, Cormac, ran the day-to-day operations with an iron fist. The middle son, Patrick, handled the financial side and had connections in Denver and Cheyenne that kept the law looking the other way. The youngest was a daughter, Sarah Beaumont, who'd been sent east for schooling and was expected back any season now. The Beaumont ranch employed over 200 men, cowboys, ranch hands, enforcers, whatever you wanted to call them. They were loyal to the brand and quick to violence if the family demanded it. The local sheriff, a man named Wilkes, wore a badge but answered to Beaumont money. Everyone in Prescott Valley knew it, and most had learned to live with it. Jacob had stayed clear of Beaumont business. He lived too far up in the mountains to be of interest to them, and his small trapping operation didn't compete with their cattle concerns. He'd heard stories, of course. Every man in the territory had. Stories of settlers who'd refused to sell their land and found their barns burned. Stories of men who'd challenged Beaumont claims and disappeared into the mountains, never to be seen again. Jacob had come to these mountains to escape violence, not find more of it. He'd left his past behind all of it and built a life of solitude and simple survival. His days followed a rhythm as old as the land itself. Check the trap lines at dawn. Skin and prepare whatever he'd caught. Tend to his small vegetable garden and the chickens he kept. Fish the streams when the trapping was slow. Read by lamplight in the evenings from the small collection of books he'd accumulated over the years. It was a lonely life, but it was his own. He answered to no one, depended on no one, and troubled no one. That was how he wanted it. The knife he carried had been his father's, and his grandfather's before that. It was a simple hunting knife with a bone handle, worn smooth from generations of use. Jacob kept it sharp and oiled, and it hung at his belt as naturally as his own hand. That knife had skinned more animals than he could count, carved the beams of his cabin, and whittled toys he sometimes left anonymously for the children in town. It was a tool, but it was also a reminder of the men who'd come before him, who'd lived honest lives working the land. His father had been a trapper in Montana before the war. His grandfather had trapped before that. It was in Jacob's blood, this life. Even when he'd strayed from it for a time, it had called him back. On this particular Tuesday in late September, Jacob made his usual ride into Prescott Valley. The autumn air was crisp and carried the promise of an early winter. The aspens on the mountain slopes were turning gold, and the elk were bugling in the high country. It was Jacob's favorite time of year. He had a good haul of beaver pelts, some fox, and a wolf hide that Otto would pay premium for. His pack mule, a patient animal named Moses, carried the load without complaint. Jacob rode his horse, a sturdy buckskin he called Buck, who knew the trail as well as Jacob did. The ride down took 4 hours, and Jacob used the time the way he always did, in quiet observation. He watched for game sign, checked the weather in the clouds, and let his mind rest in the simple rhythm of travel. These were the moments he treasured most. No demands, no complications, just a man and his animals moving through country that hadn't changed much since the old trappers first came through. He had no way of knowing that this Tuesday would be different from all the others. No way of knowing that a simple errand would unravel the careful life he'd built. No way of knowing that by sunset, everything would change. Jacob reached Prescott Valley just before noon. The main street was busy with the usual activity wagons being loaded, horses tied at hitching posts, and townsfolk going about their business. He guided Buck and Moses to the general store, where Otto was already waiting on the porch. "Jacob," Otto said with a nod, his thick accent making the name sound like Jacob. "Good timing. I have customers waiting for quality pelts." They conducted their business with the efficiency of long practice. Otto examined each pelt, named a fair price, and Jacob accepted with a handshake. The wolf hide brought a particularly good sum. A rancher up north was willing to pay premium for it. "You'll be staying for supplies?" Otto asked, as he counted out the money. Just the usual, Jacob said. Coffee, flour, salt, some tobacco if you've got the good kind. Always do for you. Otto disappeared into the store, and Jacob waited on the porch, watching the street. That's when he saw the stranger. The man was young, maybe 25, with the look of a ranch hand, dusty clothes, worn boots, a hat pulled low. But there was something nervous in the way he moved. Glancing over his shoulder as he approached the store, he caught sight of Jacob and seemed to make a quick decision. "Excuse me, sir," the young man said, his voice tight with urgency. "You heading back up the mountain today?" "I am," Jacob said carefully. "I need a favor. A big one." The young man pulled an envelope from inside his jacket. It was sealed with red wax, and a name was written across the front in careful script. "I need you to deliver this to Sarah at the boarding house. It's important. Real important." Jacob looked at the envelope, then at the young man's face. There was fear there, poorly hidden. "What's this about?" "Can't say, but it needs to get to her today. I'd do it myself, but—" He glanced over his shoulder again. "I can't be seen. Please, I'll pay you." "Keep your money," Jacob said, taking the envelope. The name read simply, "Sarah. I'll see it gets delivered." The relief on the young man's face was immediate. "Thank you. You don't know what this means." He started to turn away, then looked back. "Make sure it's today, and make sure she reads it private-like. It's personal." Before Jacob could ask anything more, the young man hurried off down the street, disappearing around the corner toward the livery. Jacob looked down at the envelope in his hand. Something about the whole encounter felt off, but he'd given his word. Otto returned with his supplies, and they loaded everything onto Moses. Jacob mentioned he needed to make a stop at the boarding house. "Mrs. Henderson's place?" Otto raised an eyebrow. "You courting someone, Jacob?" "Delivering a letter," Jacob said more curtly than he intended. Otto chuckled and went back to his work. Jacob led his animals down the street to the boarding house, a two-story building with a fresh coat of white paint and flower boxes in the windows. Mrs. Henderson kept a respectable establishment, and everyone knew it. But as Jacob approached, he saw the schoolhouse across the way. The children were at recess, playing in the yard, and through the window he could see someone moving inside. The teacher, he assumed. Sarah. Jacob looked at the envelope again. Sarah. The boarding house was where Sarah Bennett lived, but she'd be at the school right now. It would save time to deliver it there, and he was already behind schedule for the ride home. He made his decision and walked Buck over to the schoolhouse. He tied the horse and approached the door, knocking twice. "Come in," a woman's voice called. Jacob entered, removing his hat. Sarah Bennett stood at her desk, organizing papers. She looked up with a friendly smile that faltered slightly at the sight of a mountain man in her doorway. "Can I help you?" she asked politely. "Got a letter for you, ma'am," Jacob said, holding out the envelope. "Asked to deliver it today." Sarah's expression shifted to curiosity. She crossed the room and took the envelope, examining it. "From whom?" "Young fellow in town. Didn't give his name, said it was personal and important." Sarah studied the envelope a moment longer, then nodded. "Thank you for bringing it. That was kind of you." Jacob nodded, replaced his hat, and left. He had a long ride ahead, and the afternoon was wearing on. He mounted Buck and headed out of town, his mind already turning to the evening chores waiting at the cabin. Inside the schoolhouse, Sarah waited until the mountain man was gone before she broke the seal on the envelope. The letter inside was written in a hurried hand, and as she began to read, her face went pale. The letter described things that made her hands shake. Cattle rustling, yes, but worse than that. It detailed planned violence against settlers who wouldn't sell their land. It named names, ranch hands, who'd committed murders on orders from above. It described how the Beaumont family had maintained their empire through intimidation, bribery, and blood. The letter was a confession of sorts, written by someone who'd participated in these crimes and could no longer live with the weight of them. It pleaded for help, for justice, for someone to finally stand up to the Beaumonts, and it was signed with initials J.T. Sarah read it twice, her mind racing. Why had this been sent to her? She was just a school teacher. She had no power, no authority. What was she supposed to do with information like this? She looked at the envelope again, at her name written across it. Just Sarah. No last name, no. Her heart sank as understanding dawned. There was another Sarah, Sarah Beaumont, the daughter, the one everyone said was coming back from her schooling in the East. This letter wasn't meant for her at all. Jacob was 3 hours into his ride home when the realization hit him like a physical blow. He'd been thinking about the nervous young ranch hand, about the urgency in his voice, about the sealed letter marked personal. Sarah at the boarding house. That's what the young man had said. Sarah at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. Sarah Beaumont was staying at the boarding house. Everyone in town had been talking about it for weeks, how old Thomas had finally brought his daughter home, how she was staying at Mrs. Henderson's until her rooms at the ranch were properly prepared. Jacob had delivered the letter to the wrong Sarah. He reined Buck to a hard stop, his mind working through the implications. A nervous ranch hand, a sealed letter, instructions to deliver it privately. And now he'd given it to the school teacher instead of the cattle baron's daughter. Whatever was in that letter, it was important enough to make a grown man scared, important enough to require secrecy. And Jacob had just handed it to the wrong person. He turned Buck around and kicked him into a gallop. Moses, unburdened now, kept pace behind them. Jacob pushed them hard, harder than he liked, but he needed to get back to town, needed to explain the mistake, needed to get that letter back. Before what? Before someone discovered his error? Before the wrong people found out? The sun was already sinking toward the western peaks. Jacob urged Buck faster, his mind filled with a growing sense of dread he couldn't quite name. It was the same feeling he'd had years ago, right before everything in his old life had fallen apart. The feeling that something bad was coming, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. By the time he reached Prescott Valley, the streets were quiet with early evening. He rode straight to the schoolhouse, but it was dark and locked. He tried the boarding house next, asking Mrs. Henderson if she'd seen the schoolteacher. Sarah Bennett? She left about an hour ago, seemed troubled about something, didn't say where she was going. Jacob's chest tightened. And the other Sarah? Miss Beaumont? Left this morning for the ranch. Her father sent an escort. Mrs. Henderson gave him a curious look. Why? What's this about? But Jacob was already moving, back to his horse. He needed to find Sarah Bennett, needed to get that letter. But even as he rode through the darkening streets, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Dust clouds on every horizon, riders, dozens of them, converging on the town from multiple directions, and they were all coming from Beaumont land. Someone had discovered the mistake, and now they were coming to fix it. Jacob had maybe an hour of daylight left, and an army was closing in. He had to find Sarah Bennett, and he had to do it now. Dawn came cold and grey to the mountain valley. Jacob had been awake for hours, watching through the spyglass as the army assembled below. He'd been counting, and the numbers were worse than he'd feared. 212, he said quietly. Sarah came to stand beside him, wrapped in a blanket against the morning chill. She'd tried to sleep but gave up around midnight. All of them? All that I can see. Could be more in the trees. Jacob swept the glass across the assembled force. They'd organized themselves with military precision, 3 groups of about 70 men each, positioned to approach from different angles. Someone down there knew what they were doing. Which one is Cormac? Sarah asked. Jacob focused on the center group, where a man on a large black horse was giving orders. Even at this distance, Jacob could see the authority in how the other men deferred to him. That one, on the black stallion. They watched as the riders began their advance, moving slowly and carefully up the mountain trails. Jacob estimated they'd reach the cabin in about 30 minutes. Not enough time to do much more than they'd already done. A flash of silver caught Jacob's eye through the spyglass. Something had been placed carefully on a flat rock about 200 yards from the cabin. Jacob adjusted the focus and saw it clearly. A silver pocket watch, expensive and ornate, sitting on the rock like a calling card. "He wants to talk first," Jacob said. "How do you know?" "The watch. It's a message. Says he's a civilized man, that he can afford to be patient." Jacob lowered the spyglass. "Men like Beaumont, they like to win twice. Once by force, and once by breaking you before they even have to fight." Sarah's face hardened. "Then let's not give him the satisfaction." 15 minutes later, a voice called out from below. Deep, commanding, with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. "You in the cabin, my name is Cormac Beaumont. I believe you have something that belongs to my family." Jacob moved to the window but stayed back from it, out of sight. Sarah stayed low behind the table they'd reinforced. "Don't know what you're talking about," Jacob called back. "I think you do." Cormac's voice was patient, almost friendly. "A letter was delivered to the wrong person yesterday. Simple mistake. Could happen to anyone. We just want it back, along with the person who read it. And if we give you what you want, then you're free to go. You have my word as a Beaumont." Sarah caught Jacob's eye and shook her head firmly. They both knew what Cormac's word was worth, but Jacob kept the conversation going, buying time to think. "Why all the men, then, if this is just about retrieving a letter?" "Insurance. We've had some trouble with theft lately. Can't be too careful." There was amusement in Cormac's voice now. "But I'm a reasonable man. Send out Sarah Beaumont and the letter, and you can ride away from this. No one needs to get hurt." Jacob felt Sarah tense beside him. He called back, "There's no Sarah Beaumont up here." A pause. Then Cormac's voice came back, harder now. "You're telling me you don't have my sister?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you." Another pause. Longer this time. Jacob could imagine Cormac conferring with his men, realizing the mistake. When the voice came back, the friendly tone was gone. "Then who's in there with you?" "Just me and a school teacher who got caught up in your family business by accident." "The school teacher." Cormac's voice was flat now, processing this new information. "She read the letter. Wouldn't know. I just delivered it. Mountain man, I'm going to explain something to you, and I need you to listen carefully." Cormac's voice carried clearly in the morning air. "That letter contains lies, dangerous lies told by a man who betrayed my family, a man who's already paid for that betrayal. But anyone who repeats those lies, anyone who spreads them, they become our enemy too. You understand?" Jacob understood perfectly. The young ranch hand who'd given him the letter was dead, and Cormac was confirming everything the letter had said just by being here with 200 men. "So this is about killing witnesses," Jacob said. "This is about protecting our family's good name." Cormac's voice took on a reasonable tone again. "Look, I understand you're just a mountain man who delivered a letter. You didn't know what you were getting into. So, here's what I'm prepared to offer. Send out the woman and the letter, and you get to live. Keep them, and everyone in that cabin dies. It's that simple." Sarah was already shaking her head, but Jacob held up a hand. He needed Cormac to keep talking, needed to understand what they were really dealing with. "And what happens to the woman? That's between her and my father, but I give you my word she'll have a fair chance to explain herself." A fair chance. Jacob had seen what the Beaumonts considered fair. He'd heard the stories, seen the unmarked graves. "I need time to think about it," Jacob called down. "You have until noon. After that we're coming up there, and we won't be asking nicely." The sound of horses moving indicated Cormac was pulling back. Jacob returned to the spyglass and watched as the Beaumont forces spread out, forming a loose perimeter around the cabin. They were settling in for a siege, confident in their numbers and their position. Sarah came to stand beside him. "He's going to kill us both, no matter what we do." "I know. The letter names his father and both brothers for murder. They can't let anyone who's read it live." "I know that too." Jacob turned from the window to face her. "That letter, what exactly does it say?" "I need to know everything." Sarah retrieved the letter from where she'd hidden it in her jacket lining. She unfolded it carefully and began to read aloud. The details were worse than Jacob had imagined. Specific murders with dates and locations, names of witnesses who'd disappeared, payments made to law enforcement, a systematic pattern of violence designed to consolidate power and eliminate opposition. "The author worked for them for 5 years, Sarah said. "His name was Jimmy Taylor. He was one of their enforcers, the men they sent when they wanted someone scared or hurt or killed. But he couldn't do it anymore. This letter was his confession and his attempt to make things right." "By getting himself killed and nearly getting you killed too," Jacob said bitterly. "He was trying to do the right thing, maybe the only way he knew how." Jacob understood that kind of desperation. He'd felt it himself once, when he'd realized the life he was living wasn't the life he wanted. Sometimes the only way out was through, even if through meant pain and loss. He moved to the back corner of the cabin and pulled up a loose floorboard. Underneath was a metal box, carefully sealed against moisture. He opened it and began pulling out items he'd hoped never to use again. Papers first, his military discharge papers, citations for valor, letters of commendation. Then a small cloth bag that clinked with the sound of metal. Jacob poured the contents onto the table. Medals, 6 of them, for actions during the Indian campaigns. Sarah stared at the display. "Who were you?" "Someone who was good at killing." Jacob gathered up the medals and put them back in the bag. "Someone who did it for so long he forgot there was any other way to solve problems. When my wife died, when my daughter died." He stopped, the words catching in his throat, even after all these years. "I came here to forget, to be someone different." "I'm sorry," Sarah said quietly. "I didn't know. No one did." That was the point. Jacob looked at the medals one more time, then put them away. "But it doesn't change what we're facing now. Cormac Beaumont is out there with an army, and at noon he's going to order them to attack." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Can we hold them off? In here? With these walls and our supplies?" "We might last a day, maybe 2 if we're lucky and they're careless, but eventually they'll burn us out or starve us out or just overwhelm us with numbers." "Then what do we do?" Jacob moved back to the window and looked down at the assembled force. 200 men loyal to a family that had built its empire on blood and fear. 200 men who'd been ordered to kill everyone in this cabin and make sure the truth died with them. He thought about Jimmy Taylor, a young man who'd tried to make things right and paid for it with his life. He thought about Sarah Bennett, a schoolteacher who'd come west looking for purpose and found herself in the middle of a war. He thought about his own past, about the soldier he'd been and the man he'd tried to become. And he made his decision. "We make them pay for it," Jacob said. "Every step, every yard, every minute. We make them pay so dearly that maybe, just maybe, we buy enough time for something to change." What could change? I don't know yet. But in my experience, battles never go exactly as planned. Men make mistakes, leaders get overconfident, weather changes. Luck turns. Jacob checked his rifle one more time. "We've got until noon. Let's make sure we're ready to give them the fight of their lives." Sarah nodded, and together they returned to their preparations. Outside, the sun climbed higher in the sky, and 200 men waited for the order to attack. The hours before noon stretched like years. Jacob and Sarah took turns at the window, watching the Beaumont forces and waiting for the inevitable. During one of Sarah's watches, Jacob pulled out his father's old Bible from the shelf, not his teaching Bible with the flowers and notes, but a worn family Bible that had traveled with her from Pennsylvania. "Do you mind if I read?" she asked. "Go ahead." Sarah found a passage and read quietly, her voice a soft murmur in the cabin. Jacob listened as he cleaned his weapons one final time, finding unexpected comfort in the familiar words. He hadn't been much for religion since his family died, but there was something about hearing it now, in Sarah's voice, that reached a part of him he'd thought was dead. When she finished, she closed the Bible and looked at him. "Can I ask you something personal? Seems like a good time for it. Your wife and daughter, how did they—" She stopped, uncertain if she should continue. Jacob was quiet for a long moment. He'd never talked about this, not with anyone, but somehow, with this woman he'd known for less than a day, trapped in a cabin with an army outside, it felt right to finally say the words. "Cholera epidemic, 1877, swept through the fort where we were stationed." His voice was steady, but his hands stilled on the rifle. "Mary got sick first. Caroline was only 5. They both fought hard, but—" He didn't need to finish. Sarah understood. "I'm sorry, Jacob. Truly. I blamed myself for a long time. If I'd been a better provider, maybe we wouldn't have been at that fort. If I'd been smarter, maybe I would have gotten them away before the epidemic hit." Jacob set down the rifle and looked at her. "Took me years to understand that sometimes bad things just happen. No amount of strength or skill or preparation can stop them." "Is that why you came to the mountains?" "Partly. I couldn't stay in the world I'd known with them. Every place, every face reminded me of what I'd lost. I thought if I could just get far enough away, isolated enough, the pain would stop." He gave a bitter laugh. "Turns out you can't outrun grief. It follows you wherever you go." Sarah moved away from the window and sat across from him. "My mother died of pneumonia in the winter. My father followed 3 months later. The doctor said it was his heart, but I think he just didn't want to live without her. They'd been together for 30 years. 30 years, Jacob repeated. That's a long time. They were happy years. From what I saw, they had their troubles like any couple, but they were partners. Real partners." Sarah smiled sadly. "That's what I wanted when I came west. Not just a fresh start, but maybe a chance to build something like what they had. Instead, you got this. Instead, I got a chance to stand up for something that matters." Sarah met his eyes. "I've been thinking about Jimmy Taylor, about why he wrote that letter. He could have just left, could have run away and tried to forget what he'd done. But he didn't. He tried to make it right, even knowing it would probably cost him everything. And it did, yes. But his death won't be meaningless if we can get that letter to someone who can do something with it. Someone in Cheyenne, or Denver, or even Washington if necessary." Sarah leaned forward. "That's what we're really fighting for, isn't it? Not just our lives, but the chance to make sure the truth gets out." Jacob understood what she was saying, and he respected it. But he was also practical about their chances. The Beaumonts have controlled this territory for 40 years. They've survived challenges before. What makes you think one letter will be enough to bring them down? Because things are changing. The territory is becoming more civilized, more organized. The federal government is paying attention now in ways they didn't before. Sarah's voice grew more passionate. "Men like Thomas Beaumont, they're relics of an older, more violent West. Their time is ending. They know it, and that's why they're so desperate to silence anyone who threatens them." Jacob wanted to believe her, wanted to think that justice and civilization would triumph over violence and corruption. But he'd seen too much of the world to have that kind of faith. Still, looking at Sarah's determined face, at the fire in her eyes, he found himself hoping she was right. "Tell me about your students," he said, changing the subject. "The ones in your teaching Bible." Sarah's expression softened. She retrieved the Bible from where she'd set it and opened it carefully. showing him the pressed flowers and notes tucked between the pages. "This is from Emma Patterson. She's 8. She picked these wildflowers for me on the first day of school." Sarah touched the dried petals gently. "She couldn't read a word when I met her. Now she's reading full sentences." She turned to another page. "This note is from Billy Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's grandson. He wrote it himself. 'Thank you for teaching me, Miss Bennet.' Look at his handwriting. 6 months ago, he could barely hold a pencil." Jacob listened as Sarah told him about each child, their struggles, their victories, their dreams for the future. He heard the love in her voice, the pride she took in their accomplishments, and he understood why she'd been willing to risk everything for what was in that letter. These children deserved to grow up in a place where justice mattered, where powerful men couldn't murder and intimidate without consequences. Sarah was fighting for them as much as for herself. "You're a good teacher," Jacob said when she finished. "I was. I don't know if I'll get the chance to be one again." "You will." Jacob surprised himself with the certainty in his voice. "Whatever happens today, you're going to survive this. I'll make sure of it." "Jacob, no." He held up his hand. "You asked me earlier if we could hold them off. The truth is, one person probably can't. But one person can buy enough time for another person to escape. I'm not leaving you here alone. You might have to. If it comes to that, if I tell you to go, promise me you'll take that mine shaft and get to Cheyenne. Promise me you'll make sure that letter gets to the territorial marshal." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she nodded. "I promise, but only if you promise to try your hardest to survive, to come with me if at all possible. I promise." They shook hands on it. A formal agreement between two people who'd gone from strangers to partners in less than 24 hours. Jacob held her hand a moment longer than necessary, feeling the strength in her grip, the calluses from her work as a teacher. Outside, the sun reached its zenith. Noon had arrived. A voice called from below Cormac Beaumont, giving them one final chance to surrender. Jacob and Sarah looked at each other, and in that moment, they both knew what their answer would be. Jacob moved to the window and called back, his voice clear and strong. "The answer is no. We're not giving you anything. If you want what's in this cabin, you're going to have to come and take it." The silence that followed was heavy with promise. Then Cormac's voice came back, cold and final. "So be it. May God have mercy on your souls, because we won't." The sound of rifles being cocked echoed across the valley like thunder. The siege of Jacob Whitmore's cabin had begun. The first shots came at 5 minutes past noon. They weren't aimed at the cabin, not yet. They were warning shots, fired into the air to demonstrate the Beaumont force's firepower and resolve. The sound echoed off the mountain walls, multiplying until it seemed like 1,000 rifles were firing at once. Jacob had seen this tactic before in his cavalry days. It was designed to break the spirit of defenders, to make them understand how vastly outnumbered they were. He had to admit it was effective. Even knowing what to expect, the sheer volume of gunfire made his chest tight. Sarah flinched at the sound, but kept her position by the window. "How long before they actually attack?" "Not long. Cormac will send a small group first, test our defenses. When they report back, he'll know what he's dealing with." Sure enough, 10 minutes later, a group of about 20 riders began moving up the trail. They approached carefully, using the trees and rocks for cover. These weren't typical ranch hands. They moved with too much discipline, too much training. "Cavalry," Jacob muttered, "or former cavalry. How can you tell? The way they move, the way they're using the terrain." Cormac's brought in professionals. That complicated things significantly. The riders got within 100 yards before Jacob decided to show them what they were facing. He took careful aim with his rifle and fired a single shot, kicking up dirt 3 feet in front of the lead rider's horse. The message was clear. "I can hit you any time I want." The riders pulled back, faster now, returning to the main force. Jacob watched through his spyglass as they reported to Cormac. He could see the discussion, the gestures toward the cabin, the strategic planning. They know there's at least one shooter with decent aim, Jacob said. That'll make them more cautious. Is that good or bad? Good for now. Gives us more time. Jacob lowered the spyglass and turned to Sarah. But they'll adapt. They'll find another approach. Or they'll wait until dark. Or they'll... He stopped. Someone was approaching under a white flag. Not Cormac this time, but an older man on foot, walking slowly up the trail with his hands raised. Jacob recognized him through the spyglass. It's Doc Morrison, the town doctor. Sarah moved to the window. Why would they send him? I don't know. But we need to hear what he has to say. Jacob moved to the door, but kept his rifle ready. Doc Morrison, that's close enough. The doctor stopped about 50 yards from the cabin. He was in his 60s, white-haired and thin, looking uncomfortable with his role as messenger. Jacob Whitmore, Miss Bennett, I've been asked to deliver a message from Mr. Beaumont. We heard his message at noon, Jacob called back. Answer was no. This is different. This is Doc Morrison glanced back over his shoulder, then leaned forward and lowered his voice. This is from me, not from them. Please, I need to talk to you, just for a minute. Jacob and Sarah exchanged looks. This could be a trick, but Doc Morrison had always been an honest man. Jacob made a decision. Come ahead, slowly. Keep your hands where I can see them. The doctor walked forward until he was just outside the cabin door. Jacob opened it a crack, rifle ready, while Sarah covered him from the window. Make it quick, Doc. Morrison pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat. Jimmy Taylor came to see me 3 days before he died. He was scared, said he'd gotten himself into something dangerous. He gave me this and made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd find a way to get it to the right person. Jacob felt his pulse quicken. What is it? Another letter. Different from the one you have, Jimmy said. Morrison glanced back again, more nervous now. Jimmy said the first letter was bait, something to make the Beaumonts react, to draw attention. But this letter, this is the real evidence. Names, dates, locations where bodies are buried, where records are hidden, everything needed to bring down the entire operation. Sarah had moved closer to the door. Why didn't you deliver it before? CCZ 151. Because I didn't know who to trust. The law's bought and paid for. Anyone with real power is either working for the Beaumonts or scared of them. Morrison held out the letter. But Jimmy said if his plan worked, if the decoy letter got to the right person, they'd know what to do with the real one. You two, you've proven you're willing to die for the truth. That makes you the right people. Jacob took the letter, his mind racing. The Beaumonts don't know about this? No. And they can't find out. If they knew there was a second letter, Morrison didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. How did you get away from them to come here? Told Cormac I was checking to see if either of you needed medical attention before the final assault. He's got a twisted sense of honor, likes to think of himself as civilized. Morrison started backing away. I have to go back now. But listen, Jimmy Taylor died trying to make things right. Don't let it be for nothing. The doctor turned and walked back down the trail, his white flag waving in the mountain breeze. Jacob closed the door and looked at the letter in his hands. It was sealed with the same red wax as the first one, but this one was addressed simply, to whoever reads this, the truth is buried at these locations. Sarah came to stand beside him as he broke the seal. The letter inside was longer, more detailed, and written in the same hurried hand as the first, but the contents were far more damning. It started with a confession. Jimmy Taylor described how he'd been recruited by the Beaumonts at age 20, desperate for work and not asking too many questions. He detailed his first job, intimidating a farmer into selling his land for half its value. Then his second job, which involved burning a barn. Then his third, which involved more than property damage. The letter chronicled 5 years of escalating violence, beatings, murders, cover-ups. Jimmy provided specific details. dates, locations, the names of victims and perpetrators. He described where bodies were buried, exact coordinates using landmarks and natural features. He explained how the Beaumonts kept two sets of books, one for the tax authorities and one that showed their real operations. He named corrupt officials, detailed bribery schemes, and explained how the family maintained their power through a network of fear and payoffs. But the most damaging part came near the end. Jimmy described a meeting that took place 3 months ago, where Thomas Beaumont and his sons discussed their long-term strategy. They knew the territory was changing, knew that statehood was coming, and with it more federal oversight. Their plan was to consolidate power quickly, eliminate any remaining opposition, and position themselves as legitimate businessmen before anyone could challenge them. The letter ended with a simple statement: "I can't undo what I've done, but I can make sure everyone knows the truth. By the time you read this, I'll be dead. But these locations contain proof of everything I've written. Use it. End them." Sarah read over Jacob's shoulder, her face growing paler with each paragraph. When she finished, she looked up at him with something between horror and determination. "This isn't just about cattle rustling or intimidation. This is systematic murder spanning years, maybe decades. And if this information gets out," Jacob understood the implications now, "it won't just destroy the Beaumont family. It'll implicate everyone who worked with them, everyone who looked the other way. Half the territorial government could go down, which is why they're willing to kill us for it." Jacob carefully folded the letter and handed it to Sarah. "Hide this with the other one. Make sure they're somewhere the Beaumonts won't find them if when they search the cabin." Sarah took the letters and moved to the stone fireplace. She pulled out a loose stone near the base, creating a small cavity, and tucked both letters inside. Then she replaced the stone so carefully that no one would notice it had been moved. "If I have to run," she said, "I'll remember where they are." Jacob returned to the window with his spyglass. The Beaumont forces were moving again, reorganizing into a different formation. He counted at least 50 men preparing to advance, with others providing covering positions. "They're coming soon," he said, "and now we know why they're so determined. Because we don't just have evidence of their crimes," Sarah said quietly. "We have a map to all the evidence. Bodies, records, witnesses, everything they need to bury is written down in those letters. And as long as we're alive, those letters can be found." They stood in silence for a moment, absorbing the full weight of what they now possessed. 2 letters written by a dead man, containing enough information to topple an empire built on blood and fear. Information that men would kill to protect, and that 2 people were now willing to die to preserve. Jacob had thought he understood the stakes before. He'd been wrong. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about justice for every person the Beaumonts had hurt, every family they'd destroyed, every life they'd taken. This was about making sure that power built on violence would finally face consequences. And it all depended on 2 people in a mountain cabin, surrounded by 200 men who wanted them dead. "We need a new plan," Jacob said, his mind working through possibilities. "The mine shaft, you're taking it tonight, as soon as it's dark enough." "Jacob, no arguments. With what we know now, it's more important than ever that at least one of us survives. You're going to take the letters, make your way to Cheyenne, and deliver them to the territorial marshal. No matter what happens to me, you finish this." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked, "What will you do?" "Buy you as much time as I can." Jacob checked his weapons one more time. "And make sure that if they do take me, I go down fighting hard enough that they believe they got everything. You'll have a head start before they realize you've escaped. They'll track me, maybe, but you'll have darkness and surprise on your side, and by the time they figure out you're gone, you'll be too far ahead to catch." Jacob met her eyes. "This is what Jimmy Taylor died for. This is what we've been fighting for since yesterday. Now we have the means to actually accomplish it." Sarah nodded slowly, understanding that he was right, even as she hated what it meant. I'll need directions through the mine. I'll draw you a map. And Sarah, Jacob hesitated, then said what needed to be said. If I don't make it, tell people that a mountain man tried to make up for past mistakes. Tell them that at the end, he stood for something that mattered. I will. But you're going to tell them yourself, because you're going to survive this. Jacob wanted to believe that, wanted to think they could both walk away from this alive. But he'd been a soldier long enough to know the odds. Sometimes, the best you could hope for was that your death meant something. Outside, Cormac Beaumont gave an order. The sound of it carried clearly up the mountain, and then, with the precision of trained men, the attack began in earnest. The first wave hit the cabin like a storm, 50 men advancing in coordinated groups, providing covering fire for each other as they moved up the trail. Jacob had fought in enough battles to recognize professional tactics when he saw them. These weren't amateur ranch hands shooting wildly. These were men who'd been trained for combat. He took his time with the first shot, letting them get close enough to feel confident. Then he squeezed the trigger, and a man went down, clutching his shoulder. Not a kill shot. Jacob wanted them to know they were facing someone who could choose where his bullets went. The advancing force hesitated, seeking cover. Jacob used that moment to shift position, firing from a different window. Another shot, another man down. Sarah was at the opposite window with the shotgun, not firing yet, but ready if anyone got too close. Don't waste ammunition, Jacob reminded her. Make every shot count. The siege continued for 2 hours, with waves of men advancing and being driven back. Jacob's marksmanship kept them cautious, unable to make a direct assault without taking casualties. But he could see their strategy developing. They were probing for weaknesses, testing different approaches, learning the cabin's defensive capabilities. Worse, they were slowly surrounding the cabin, cutting off potential escape routes. Jacob had expected this, but it still troubled him. If Sarah was going to use the mine shaft, they needed to move soon. How much ammunition do we have left? Sarah asked, during a lull in the fighting. Jacob did a quick count, enough for maybe 2 more hours of sustained fighting, less if they push hard. And then it comes down to my father's knife and whatever else we can use. Jacob reloaded his rifle, his movements automatic from years of practice. But it won't come to that. You're leaving before we run dry. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks. In another 3 hours, it would be dark enough for Sarah to attempt the mine shaft escape. Jacob just had to hold out until then. A new tactic emerged in the next wave. The Beaumont men approached with large wooden shields, barn doors torn from their hinges and carried like Roman shields. It was crude but effective, giving them cover as they advanced. Jacob's shots splintered the wood but didn't penetrate. They're adapting, Sarah observed. Good men always do. Jacob shifted to target the men's legs beneath the shields. Another shot, another man down. But adaptation takes time, and time is what we need. Around 4 in the afternoon, the attacks suddenly stopped. Jacob watched through his spyglass as the Beaumont forces pulled back to their original positions. Cormac was reorganizing, changing his strategy. What are they doing? Sarah asked. Rethinking their approach. They've taken casualties. I count at least 8 wounded, maybe more. Cormac's realizing this won't be as easy as he thought. Jacob collapsed the spyglass. He'll try something different next. Maybe wait until dark, maybe try to smoke us out. Sarah moved away from the window and sat at the table, pulling out the letters from their hiding place. She read through them again, her lips moving silently as she memorized key details. If something happens to me, she said, if I lose the letters somehow, I need to be able to tell the authorities what's in them. Smart thinking. Jimmy Taylor mentions specific locations. 3 graves in Box Canyon, records hidden in a barn near Swift Creek, a witness living under a false name in Denver. Sarah closed her eyes, committing it to memory. If I can remember even half of this, it might be enough. Jacob watched her work, impressed by her focus under pressure. Most people would have fallen apart by now, but Sarah had the kind of strength that came from deep conviction. She wasn't just fighting for survival, she was fighting for a purpose larger than herself. He moved to the back of the cabin and pulled aside a rough wooden partition, revealing the mine shaft entrance. The opening was barely 3 feet high, reinforced with old timbers that Jacob had shored up over the years. He'd explored about half a mile of the shaft when he first built the cabin, knowing it could serve as an emergency exit. "Come here," he called to Sarah. "I need to show you the route." Sarah joined him, and Jacob lit a lantern so she could see into the darkness. The shaft descended at a gentle angle, the walls rough-hewn rock that glistened with moisture. "Stay to the right, where the shaft branches about 200 yards in. The left branch collapsed years ago." Jacob pulled out paper and began sketching a rough map by lantern light. "At half a mile, you'll reach a large cavern. Cross it, keeping the wall on your left. On the far side, there's another tunnel, narrower but passable. That leads to the canyon exit. How will I know when I'm there? You'll feel wind, fresh air from outside. The exit is partially hidden by brush, but you can push through." Jacob added details to the map, landmarks, hazards, approximate distances. "The canyon runs north-south. Follow it south for about 3 miles until you reach the main valley road. From there, it's a hard 2-day ride to Cheyenne, if you can get a horse." Sarah studied the map, tracing the route with her finger. "What about you? When will you follow?" "I won't." Jacob said it simply, stating a fact. "Once you're clear, I'll collapse the tunnel entrance. They'll think we're both still in here, give you more time to get away." "Collapse it? How?" "There's a support beam near the entrance that's load-bearing. Pull it out, and the whole thing comes down." Jacob met her eyes. "I'll do it from the cabin side, trap myself in here. But it means they'll focus all their attention on this position, not on searching for you." Sarah's face showed her struggle, wanting to argue, wanting to find another way, but knowing he was right. There has to be another option. "If there is, I haven't thought of it." Jacob handed her the map. "Memorize this, then destroy it. Can't risk them finding it on you." They spent the next hour going over every detail of the escape plan. Jacob gave her his compass, his father's old military compass that had guided him through a dozen campaigns. He packed her a small bag with food, water, matches, and a knife. He showed her how to move quietly through the tunnel, how to navigate by touch if the lantern failed, how to mark her path so she wouldn't get turned around. As the sun touched the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Jacob knew the time was approaching. Once full darkness fell, Sarah would have to go. "I need to tell you something," Sarah said as they waited. "In case I don't get another chance. You'll have plenty of chances. Jacob, please, let me say this." She turned to face him fully. "When I came west, I was running away from grief and loss. I thought if I could just start over somewhere new, I could leave the pain behind. But you can't escape who you are or what you've experienced. It shapes you, makes you who you need to be for whatever comes next." Jacob understood what she meant. He'd tried the same thing, and it had taken him 15 years to learn that lesson. "What I'm trying to say is—" Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. "Meeting you, fighting alongside you, it's reminded me that isolation isn't the same as peace. Real peace comes from standing with others, from fighting for something that matters, from being willing to sacrifice for a cause larger than yourself." "Sarah, I know we barely know each other. I know this situation is extreme and emotions run high. But I want you to know that if circumstances were different, if we'd met in town under normal conditions, I would have wanted to know you better, would have wanted to see if—" She stopped, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. Jacob felt something shift in his chest, a feeling he'd thought was dead and buried with his wife 15 years ago. He reached out and took Sarah's hand. "I know," he said quietly. "I feel it too." They stood like that for a moment, two people who'd been thrown together by chance and mistake, finding an unexpected connection in the face of violence and death. Jacob wanted to say more, wanted to tell her about the hope she'd awakened in him, the sense that maybe life held more possibilities than he'd allowed himself to believe. But outside, darkness was falling, and with it came new sounds. The Beaumont forces were moving again, preparing for a night assault. "They're coming," Jacob said, releasing her hand. "It's time." Sarah nodded, her face set with determination. She retrieved the letters from their hiding place and tucked them securely inside her jacket. She checked her supplies one final time, making sure everything was ready. Jacob led her to the mine entrance and helped her light a lantern. The warm glow illuminated her face, and he saw the fear there mixed with resolve. "Follow the map exactly," he reminded her. "Don't rush, but don't stop unless you absolutely have to." "And Sarah," he paused, making sure she understood. "Whatever you hear behind you, whatever you think is happening, don't come back. You keep moving forward until you reach Cheyenne." "I will. I promise." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you, Jacob Whitmore, for everything. Thank you for reminding me what's worth fighting for." Sarah leaned forward and kissed him, brief and gentle, a promise and a goodbye all at once. Then she turned and entered the mine shaft, her lantern casting dancing shadows on the rough stone walls. Jacob watched until the light disappeared around the first bend. Then he moved to the support beam he'd identified, the one that held up the tunnel entrance. He'd need to wait, give her enough time to get deep into the mountain before he brought it down. 30 minutes, maybe 40. He returned to the main room and took his position at the window. The Beaumont forces were moving in darkness now, using the cover of night to advance. Jacob could see torches, dozens of them, creating a ring of light that was slowly tightening around the cabin. Cormac's voice called out again, echoing in the darkness. "Last chance, mountain man. Send out the woman and the letter, and this ends peacefully." Jacob thought about Sarah, now somewhere deep in the mountain, carrying the truth that would topple an empire. He thought about Jimmy Taylor, who died to make this moment possible. He thought about all the innocent people the Beaumonts had hurt over the years, and about the justice that was finally coming for them. He raised his voice and called back, his words carrying clearly through the mountain night. "Come and take them if you can, Beaumont, but I promise you, you're going to pay for every step." The torches began to move, and Jacob Whitmore prepared to make his final stand. The gunshot never came. Instead, a voice from outside the cabin, clear and authoritative, cut through the tension. "Cormac Beaumont. This is Marshal Edward Wright of the United States Territorial Marshal Service. You and your men are surrounded. Drop your weapons." Cormac froze, his pistol still aimed at Jacob. For a moment, no one moved. Then, from outside, came the unmistakable sound of dozens of rifles being cocked in unison. "I said drop your weapons. Now." Jacob saw the calculation in Cormac's eyes, the weighing of options, the realization that his 200 men might be outgunned, and certainly were outmaneuvered. Slowly, Cormac lowered his pistol. "Outside, all of you. Hands where we can see them." The Beaumont men filed out, leaving Jacob standing alone in his destroyed cabin. He sank down onto what remained of his chair, the adrenaline draining away and leaving only pain and exhaustion. His shoulder throbbed, his cuts burned, and he was fairly certain at least 2 of his ribs were cracked. But he was alive. And Sarah had escaped. Marshal Wright entered the cabin, a tall man in his 50s with a steel-grey mustache and the bearing of someone who'd spent his life enforcing law in hard places. He took in the scene with experienced eyes. "Jacob Whitmore? That's me. You look like hell, Mr. Whitmore." Wright moved closer, his expression mixing respect and concern. You're also either the bravest man I've met or the most foolish. Probably both. How did you—" Jacob's voice was rough from smoke and shouting. "How did you know?" "We didn't. Not at first." Wright helped Jacob to his feet. "Let's get you outside where my deputy can look at those wounds. Then I'll explain." Outside, the scene was surreal. Cormac Beaumont and his men sat on the ground with their hands on their heads. Surrounded by what Jacob now saw was a force of at least 50 federal marshals and cavalry troops. Torches illuminated the scene, and in their light, Jacob saw faces he recognized: Otto Garrett from the general store, several farmers and ranchers from around Prescott Valley, even Doc Morrison. A deputy marshal tended to Jacob's wounds, while Wright explained, "3 days ago, we received a telegram in Cheyenne. Anonymous tip about illegal activities by the Beaumont family. Normally, we'd need more than an anonymous tip to mobilize, but this one included specific details, dates, locations, names. Enough that we had to investigate." Jacob understood. Jimmy Taylor. That was the name signed on the telegram, yes. Whoever sent it knew we'd need time to organize a response, so he gave us a head start. Wright pulled out a piece of paper. "Then yesterday, we received another message. This one from Doc Morrison here, saying that a mountain man and a school teacher were under siege by the Beaumont family and needed immediate assistance." Doc Morrison stepped forward, looking both proud and nervous. "I couldn't just stand by. After I delivered that second letter to you, I rode straight for the telegraph office. The operator is a friend. He sent the message before anyone could stop him." "The Beaumonts controlled the telegraph," Jacob said. "They thought they did. But not everyone in this territory is afraid of them. Not anymore." Wright gestured to the assembled townspeople. "When word spread that you two were making a stand, people started coming forward. Witnesses, victims, people who'd been terrorized into silence. We've been gathering testimony all day." Jacob looked at the faces around him, ordinary people who'd found their courage because 2 strangers had been willing to stand against corruption. It was humbling and inspiring in equal measure. "The school teacher," Jacob said urgently. "Sarah Bennett. She escaped through a mine shaft. She's carrying evidence letters that detail everything the Beaumonts have done. She's trying to reach Cheyenne." Wright nodded. "We'll send riders to intercept her on the Valley Road, bring her in safely. She doesn't need to make that journey alone anymore. She has names, locations, everything needed to—" Jacob stopped as a commotion at the edge of the clearing caught his attention. Riders were arriving, escorting someone. In the torchlight, Jacob saw auburn hair and a determined face streaked with dirt and exhaustion. Sarah. She dismounted before her escort could help her, her eyes searching the crowd until they found Jacob. Relief flooded her face, followed immediately by concern when she saw his injuries. "You're alive," she said, moving to him. "You came back. I heard the gunfire stop. I heard voices shouting about marshals." Sarah pulled the letters from her jacket. "I couldn't keep running when I knew help had arrived. I had to know." She didn't finish. Jacob reached out with his good arm and pulled her close, and she came willingly, the letters clutched between them. They stood like that for a long moment, 2 people who'd survived against impossible odds, who'd trusted each other when trust was all they had. Marshal Wright cleared his throat diplomatically. "Miss Bennett, I presume?" "I'm Marshal Wright. I believe you have something for me." Sarah reluctantly pulled away from Jacob and handed over the letters. Wright read them by torchlight, his expression growing harder with each paragraph. "This is enough," he said finally. "More than enough. The Beaumont family's empire ends tonight." Cormac Beaumont, sitting with his men, heard those words. His face showed the full realization of defeat, not just a battle lost, but everything his family had built over 40 years crumbling in a single night. "You can't prove any of that," Cormac said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We can, and we will," Wright replied. "Your man, Jimmy Taylor, was very thorough. He gave us locations where evidence is buried. We've already sent teams to verify. By morning we'll have bodies exhumed, records recovered, witnesses protected. He folded the letters carefully. Your father and brothers will be arrested by noon tomorrow. You're all going to face justice for every crime detailed in these letters. Jacob watched as the reality of defeat settled over the Beaumont men. Some looked relieved, men who'd been forced into service and could now be free. Others looked defiant, loyal to the end. But Cormac himself just looked broken, a man who'd believed his family was untouchable, learning too late that no one was above the law. Doc Morrison approached Jacob and Sarah. I'm sorry I couldn't help sooner. I'm sorry. I was too afraid. You helped when it mattered, Sarah interrupted gently. You gave us that second letter. You sent for the marshals. You saved our lives. Jimmy Taylor saved your lives, Morrison said. I just delivered his final message. They all stood in silence, thinking about the young ranch hand who'd given everything to make things right. His name would be remembered, Jacob thought, not for the crimes he'd committed, but for the courage he'd shown at the end. 3 weeks later, Jacob stood outside the schoolhouse in Prescott Valley, a legal document in his hand. His shoulder still ached from the torn muscle, and his ribs were still tender, but he was healing. The physical wounds, at least, would fade with time. Sarah emerged from the schoolhouse, her students streaming past her into the afternoon sunshine. She'd been back at teaching for a week now, and the routine had helped both of them find their footing after everything that had happened. Is that what I think it is? She asked, gesturing to the document. Jacob nodded. Came through this morning. Official commendation from the territorial governor for extraordinary courage in defense of justice and the rule of law. He read the words with a mixture of pride and embarrassment. They're making us out to be heroes, aren't we? Sarah smiled. Maybe not the way we planned, but yes, I'd say we earned it. The past 3 weeks had been transformative for Prescott Valley and the entire territory. The Beaumont family, Thomas, Cormac, and Patrick, were in federal custody in Cheyenne, awaiting trial on charges ranging from murder to racketeering. The evidence Jimmy Taylor had documented proved overwhelming. Martial rights teams had recovered bodies, found hidden records, and secured testimony from witnesses who'd been too afraid to speak before. The territorial newspapers had covered every detail. Jacob and Sarah's stand at the mountain cabin had captured public imagination, a mountain man and a schoolteacher facing down 200 gunmen to protect the truth. The story had spread beyond Wyoming, picked up by papers in Denver, San Francisco, even back east where Sarah's old colleagues read about her with amazement. But the real victory, Jacob thought, wasn't in the headlines or the commendations. It was in the change he saw in the town around him. People walked taller now, spoke more freely. The shadow that had hung over the valley for 40 years had lifted, and in its absence, something new was growing. Walk with me? Sarah asked. They strolled down the main street, nodding to townspeople who called out greetings. Otto Garrett waved from the general store. Mrs. Henderson smiled from her boarding house porch. Even Sheriff Wilkes, who'd resigned in disgrace and was awaiting his own legal proceedings, had been replaced by a deputy marshal who actually enforced the law without bias. I've been offered a position, Jacob said as they walked. Deputy town marshal. Marshal Wright said they need someone who knows the territory and can handle himself in a crisis. Are you going to take it? I'm thinking about it. Jacob had spent 15 years avoiding exactly this kind of responsibility, but recent events had taught him something important. Isolation isn't the same as peace. You said that to me once, and you were right. Maybe it's time I stopped hiding from the world and started being part of it again. They reached the edge of town, where a small plot of land sat empty. It had once belonged to a farmer the Beaumonts had driven off. Now, with the family's assets being seized and redistributed, properties like this were becoming available. I put in a claim, Sarah said, surprising him. For this land, Thought maybe I could build something here. Not just a house, a real school. Bigger than what we have now, with room for more students. Maybe even a small library. Jacob looked at the empty plot, then at Sarah's face, bright with hope and possibility. It is, but it's a big dream for one person. She turned to face him directly. Jacob, these past weeks, I've realized something. When we were in that cabin, fighting for our lives, I wasn't afraid because you were there. Not just because you could shoot or knew tactics, but because I trusted you completely. Because we were partners. Jacob felt his heart beat faster. Sarah, I'm not asking for promises or commitments. I know we barely know each other, and I know we both have healing to do from our pasts. Sarah reached out and took his hand. But I'd like the chance to know you better. To see if what we felt in that cabin was just adrenaline and fear, or if it was something real. Something that could last. Jacob looked down at her hand in his small but strong, scarred from her ordeal but still capable of gentleness. He thought about his wife, about the years of grief and isolation, about the walls he'd built around himself. Then he thought about the past 3 weeks, about how Sarah had visited him every day while he recovered, about the conversations they'd had and the comfortable silences they'd shared. I'd like that too, he said simply. They stood together in the empty plot, imagining the future that might be built there. A school where children could learn. A community where people could live without fear. A life where two people who'd found each other in the darkest circumstances could build something bright and lasting. A rider approached from the direction of Cheyenne, one of Marshal Wright's deputies. He pulled up beside them with news. The trial date has been set. 3 months from now. They'll need both of you to testify. Jacob and Sarah exchanged glances. It wasn't over yet, not completely. There would be a trial, testimony, reliving those terrifying hours. But they would face it together, just as they'd faced everything else. We'll be there, Sarah said. The deputy tipped his hat and rode on. Jacob and Sarah remained where they were, watching the sun set over the valley that was slowly becoming a place of justice instead of fear. You know what I keep thinking about, Sarah said quietly. Jimmy Taylor. How he gave everything to make this possible. Sometimes I wonder if he knew, if he understood that his sacrifice would change so many lives. I think he hoped, Jacob said. Hope was probably all he had left at the end. Hope that someone would care enough to act on the truth he'd risked everything to reveal. We didn't let him down. No, we didn't. As darkness fell over Prescott Valley, Jacob walked Sarah back to the boarding house. At her door, she turned and kissed him longer this time, with promise and possibility. When they parted, both were smiling. Tomorrow, Sarah said, I'll show you my plans for the school. I'd value your thoughts. Tomorrow, Jacob agreed. And Sarah, thank you. For what? For reminding me that life is worth living, that there are still things worth fighting for, worth building, worth hoping for. Sarah touched his face gently. We reminded each other. That's what partners do. Jacob watched her go inside, then turned toward the small room he'd been renting above the general store. His mountain cabin was gone, destroyed in the siege, and then further collapsed when the marshals had tried to excavate the mine shaft. But he found he didn't mourn it. That cabin had been a sanctuary, yes, but also a prison, a place to hide rather than a place to live. Now, walking through the town as night settled in, Jacob Whitmore felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years. He felt at home. Not in a place, but in a purpose. Not in isolation, but in connection. The story had started with a mistake, a letter delivered to the wrong woman. But maybe, Jacob thought, it wasn't a mistake at all. Maybe it was exactly what needed to happen for two people to find each other, for a corrupt empire to fall, and for a community to finally be free. In 3 months, they would return to Cheyenne to testify. The Beaumont family would face justice, and the full story of their crimes would be made public. But for now, in this quiet evening in a small mountain town, Jacob allowed himself to simply be present, to feel the cool air on his face, to hear the sounds of families settling in for the night, to anticipate tomorrow and the chance to help Sarah build her dream. Sometimes the smallest moments change everything. One wrong name on an envelope, one decision to do the right thing instead of the easy thing. One mountain man and one schoolteacher willing to stand against impossible odds. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate, those moments lead not to endings but to new beginnings. Jacob smiled to himself and headed home, already looking forward to tomorrow.